Welcome, everybody. I'm John Paul Mendoza, Dr. Speed Selling. This is the Raging Verbalist number 146. This is a very special episode. I guess they're all special episodes to a certain extent, but this is a special episode because it's like a day to remember. And for those of you who are just joining for the first time, like, subscribe, notification, do all those things, comment. That would be kind of cool. Say nice things. Why not? If you don't like it, click on something else. I mean, there's a lot of choice. Anyway, don't click it. We don't dabble in politics, but we dabble in a lot of other things that come across my head and my brain. But to keep me on the track, keep me from going off the rails, keep me from doing that is the ever lovely Sandra. Sandra has been playing hurt. For those of you who don't know, she had major surgery, oral surgery, and they're reconstructing her mouth, something about bar fights when she was young or something. And Sandra, welcome. I mean, I don't know if you want to clear that up or not, but I mean, so
keep them wondering.
So how are you doing? So welcome, and how are you doing today?
Doing good. And yourself?
I'm excited. This is kind of like one of those that, you just look at the calendar and you circle it and you go, yeah, this is it. So, all right. So we're going to, what are we talking about today? What is our topic for today? And by the way, if you go to the Facebook group, which is the Position to Win book Facebook group, if you go there, you can always chat and put some questions in there and all of that. So, but be nice, because Sandra will read it. And, she has very sensitive, delicate ears and eyes. So, all right. So what are we talking about today?
All right. We're talking about James Dean. So tell us, who is James Dean?
So for those of you who don't know, James Dean was an actor, and James Dean had a very short but exciting, meteoric, or some would say almost like a bright shooting star that went across the sky in the early 1950s. And if you look it up, he was active from about 1950 to 1955, and you'll find out why. And the reason why this is one of those days that you got to mark on your calendar is that 67 years ago today, sadly, he was killed in a car crash and did not survive that. And we'll get into more details about, but he ended up only being in 3 movies, but ended up with 2 Oscar nominations. And that's quite a tribute to him, if you will. Too bad he did not live longer. Who knows what he would have done if he had more time. So that's kind of in the slight version of who James Dean was.
All right. So why did he become so popular seemingly overnight?
Well, I think he had a great look to him, kind of a great way that he carried himself. And of course, he was long gone when I really kind of got interested in, movies and cinema and studied what had happened, because of course, when you start studying cinema, you always come upon these kind of anomalies. Now, there are one-hit wonders, but I don't think he was going to be one of those. So I think he had the right look, but I also think that he connected with that younger audience in a way that no one else was connecting with. So he was, into that whole right fit. I mean, he was himself just in his early 20s. And I think that really kind of helped that process along. New generation, if you will, reckless youth, lots of identification, and, went from television to movies pretty seamlessly, and had charisma to command the screen, which is a big, big factor.
All right. And what were the 3 movies that he was in?
Well, he was in a movie called East of Eden, which was an adaptation of a John Steinbeck novel. By the way, Steinbeck met him, didn't like him at all, thought he was too moody and too, cantankerous, but thought he would fit the role very well, which he did. And of course, that was a big deal. I mean, Steinbeck is obviously, at that point in time, a very famous writer, having written lots of different novels, The Red Fern, Of Mice and Men, and of course, East of Eden. So that was his first movie. And his second movie, which was really the one that gave him that meteoric, explosive rise, if you will, that came out while he was still alive, was Rebel Without a Cause. And this is really on the heels of Brando doing the whole motorcycle outlaw thing. But this is that youth trapped in that, netherland between, being an adult and being a child, and how does that work out, and all of the issues and problems that you run into with that. And Rebel Without a Cause is also a pretty interesting movie. And then his final movie was Giant. And, Giant is a movie that came out after he had passed away. He ended up getting nominated both for, I believe it was Rebel Without a Cause and Giant posthumously. He was the only actor ever in history to be nominated once, if not twice, for an Oscar.
Right. And did you see all three movies?
I did, and I did this when I was, in my reckless youth, and I was, doing this whole gig about, being into cinema. And they had a little bit of a, during this film festival, they had that they were going to play his movies 3 days in a row. So it's interesting because you get to watch, each of them in its entirety you're not watching them on television. You're not watching them with commercials. You're not watching them all chopped up. You're watching them, the way that somebody would have watched them. And in my case, this was in the 70s. So, I mean, this is, almost 20 years later, and watching what this looked like. And I think that it was, really quite remarkable how he acted, how the movies worked out, and all that. Now, let me ask you, obviously, since you were younger, have you had an opportunity to see James Dean's movies?
So I've only seen Rebel Without a Cause, and it was a while ago when I was a teenager. So even, you know, later on. And so I should have a movie night and just watch all three. It'd be good.
You definitely should have a movie
Yeah.
night, because they're very, and I think watching them in order would help. I'll tell you something else that would help, and that's for all of you, if you want to find out how to make your business successful, your life successful, what you want to do is check out Most Businesses Fail in the First 5 Minutes. It just takes them 3 to 5 years to realize it, position to win. James Dean was amazingly positioned, not only in his life, though I don't know if he was doing it consciously or not, but he was well positioned. And then posthumously, after his passing, amazing how his stardom kept rising over and over again. Now, we cannot guarantee that you will become the next James Dean and be remembered 67 years after your demise, but what we can do is say that you will learn a lot of things. It's available in both physical copy. You can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or Position to Win book.com website, positionwinbook.com, book.com website. Also, you can go and get the digital copy in all digital formats with Kindle, Nook, and Apple. And then for those of you who have started the transition or are still in the transition, or you're thinking that maybe you're going to have to go back and get a real gig, make sure that you check out Remote Work for a Better World. It talks about how to do things remotely and do it better. And I can tell you that most people really, really suck at working remotely. So go check that out. Also at positiontowinbook.com. Lots of cool freebies for those of you who want to just kind of find out more about what I do and how this all fits in there. All right, Sandra. So what is the next thing that we're going to cover? What are we going to dive into here?
All right. So what led to his tragic accident?
He ended up buying a Porsche 356. And, the first race he ever entered, he won the novice class, the amateur class, and he finished second overall, which is like amazing. And then each race that he was in, he did really well, but he didn't feel like he had enough capability. So he bought what was called a Porsche 550 Spyder. It's a very famous car. And, he went and bought it and got it. And in fact, picked it up on September the 23rd, according to records and legend and otherwise. And this was going to be the first race he was going to drive in. And in fact, he was convinced that he should drive it to the race itself. And that turned out to be not a great decision. But I can tell you that is a very iconic car. In fact, the Porsche 550 Spyder, if you find one, a real one, they're worth gazillions of dollars. There was actually a guy named Chuck Beck who built a replica of one. There's other people make them too. And Chuck Beck was really serious about that. And my mentor, Big Joe, and I said, look, just down the street, Chuck Beck is building these things. And, hey, we had some time, right? We had finished a little bit early on sales calls. So we went out and hung out at Chuck Beck's. You could go Google who Chuck Beck is, but we went out and hung out and saw his Beck Speedster, which was like the, reincarnation of this car. Too bad we didn't have like cameras like today, because I would have loved to first off taking pictures with Chuck, because he was a pretty cool guy, and also take pictures of me sitting in the car. Subsequently, he sold the business, he moved, he's probably passed away because he wasn't a spring chicken, but he loved the car partially because of James Dean. So, it's a pretty iconic look and an iconic vehicle.
And what was the name of his car?
So he called his car the Little Bastard, and it had lots of connotation, that bad boy image that he had. In fact, Johnny Depp gives credit that one of the things that motivated him to go into acting was watching James Dean. So who knows if that was truly the case, but it sounds cool. But yeah, it was called the Little Bastard, and there's some pretty cool pictures on the web about him.
All right, and describe the accident and what happened to his car afterward.
So he decides he's going to drive the car from LA to this race in, really up by San Luis Obispo. And he takes off, and he actually had the stunt driver or a stunt coordinator with him. And they're hauling ass. In fact, there were two cars, and they were hauling ass, and they get pulled over by the highway patrol, and both were ticketed for speeding. And they then continued on. And I'm sure that in those days, it's all 2-lane highways. And so they're rolling along. A car turned in front of them. The guy was driving a Ford sedan, and James Dean slammed on the brakes, hit the car sideways, was thrown out of the car, and lots of bystanders. Apparently, there was a woman who got out of a car who was a nurse, said that she felt the faint, pulse, but by the time he gets to the hospital, he was pronounced dead. Later, the inquest, blamed speeding. Lots of people question if he was speeding or not, but he couldn't, given the technology and given what was going on, he couldn't stop. And nobody talks about, I think the stunt coordinator was not killed. So James Dean was pretty sad ending to that whole affair. And it took a while for the world to even kind of know about it, because it was kind of a remote part of California. I mean, today we're totally connected everywhere that we're at, kind of thing. But in those days, it was a little bit tougher. Oh, and then what happened to the car? That was what you asked me that too. It pops back up because I got so involved in that. So what happened to the car is that a doctor who was I guess treated him took the engine. I don't know who this guy was, but took the engine. But the car itself ended up getting sold to a famous king of customizers, George Barris. And George Barris thought, well, this would be a kind of a cool thing. There's cachet. By the way, if those of you who don't know who George Barris was, he did cars like, the Batmobile that, from the original TV show was one of his creations. Anyway, he thought it'd be really cool that he could put this on, he bought it and he could put it on exhibit. And this was the James Dean car right now. Apparently people say that there was a curse to the car, that if you walked up to it, people would get, spontaneous cuts from it. I mean, I think that was a bunch of, maybe a little bit too much of the, imagination. But the fascinating thing of what happened to the car is that it was being transported to Miami in 1960. So now this is 5 years after the accident. And it never arrived. It was like, one of those mystery things where, okay, what happened to it? I mean, you can't disappear. And it was a pretty light car, but you can't disappear like a 1,700-pound car or something in the middle of nowhere. Where did it go? And it's never been found. And nobody knows where it is, which only adds to the mystery of what we're talking about today. So whoever has that car has it under wraps and, knows about it. But if you see photos of it, it was really quite destroyed and very chewed up.
Right. And why do you think his image has gone on for so long?
Well, I think that all of the mythology built up around him. Yeah, I mean, he had the right look. He had that right kind of outside of the box. There's lots of questions about, how who he dated, and there was a lot of other things around that. I mean, there's some speculation that he went both ways. I mean, which at that time was like really verboten kind of to discuss it. And then yet, people would just pick up on that. So the Eagles, and I don't want to be, we don't want this canceled because like they've got people listening in everywhere. But Eagles wrote a song called James Dean, and 1974. So 19 years after he dies, they have a hit song with that. And then the Goo Goo Dolls in 1989 have a song about James Dean, and I've listened to both of them. I mean, I listened to James Dean when it came out, but I mean, just, the Goo Goo Dolls were not necessarily somebody I have in my playlist, but I went and listened to it again. James Dean's image just kept going and going and going. And I think part of it is the fact that he had that, the parts that he played and the look that he had. I mean, who wouldn't want to be, that guy, if you're that guy?
And what are the positioning and branding lessons one can learn from James Dean's legacy?
Well, it's the realization that whenever you're building your brand or you're positioning yourself, whenever you're doing any of those things, what you have to realize is that there's the real person, at which we don't really know. I mean, so many people have written books about James Dean. Hey, I once handed him, a quart of oil, and here's my life with James Dean. I mean, there's so many different books that were written about him. So that drove this thing called the mythology. So whenever you're building a brand, there's a certain mythology, because there's the real person or the real product or the real whatever, but then there's this mythology, and that mythology is really what has gone on. And since humans have been telling each other stories, there's always this certain mythology. And the mythology around James Dean, I think, is a great lesson and something to watch. I'm sure that there are other songs that were written about it. Those are the two most famous that I uncovered during this, but I'm sure that there's going to be more. And James Dean continues to be that ongoing iconic person. Again, 67 years ago today, he perished in a car crash, and that wasn't that big a news if somebody died on a highway in 1955 and crashed into somebody. I mean, car safety has changed a lot, but it was a big deal because he was who he was, and he had so many things going on. So I don't, I would not recommend that to drive home your mythology of who you are, that you pass away. But what I would suggest is that you start thinking about how you build that sense of mythology that goes around famous people on a regular basis. And if you do that, what you'll discover is that your positioning and branding improve dramatically. It all comes down to, what is the story? Is it a great story, or is it a boring story? And you never want to tell a boring story. And with that, I just want to thank Sandra and you for coming and hanging with us for a little bit on the Raging Verbalist. And if you'd be so kind, if you'd be so nice on this day in memory of James Dean, how's that for rampant exploitation, to hit that like button, share it, subscribe, do all those things. But the interesting thing is, learn from his life. His movies are worth watching today. And I don't think that they're nearly as dated as some other things from that period. And with that, I'm John Paul Mendoza, Dr. Speed Selling, and the Raging Verbalist is now over.